He never told anyone, not his wife, not his children, not his closest friend, not the man who had stood beside him in the mud and the cold and the dark, not the priest who heard his confession every Sunday for 40 years, not the doctor who sat with him in his final weeks for 68 years. He carried it alone. And when he died, when his family finally sat down to go through the things he had left behind, they found it at the bottom of an old canvas bag, tucked beneath a folded coat and a broken compass and 3 letters that had never been sent. A medal. But not his. This is not the story of what Thomas did in the war. This is the story of what he chose not to do, and what that choice cost him for the rest of his life. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what the autumn of 1944 looked like from the ground, not from the maps. Not from the history books. Not from the generals who moved small wooden pieces across large tables in warm rooms far from the sound of anything. From the ground. It was cold in a way that got inside you and stayed there. The kind of cold that didn't care about your uniform or your rank or which side of the line you were standing on. The roads through northern France had turned to mud weeks earlier, and every step cost something. Boots soaked through. Hands that stopped feeling sometime around the 3rd week of October. Men who had stopped talking not because there was nothing to say but because words took energy. And energy was the one thing nobody had to spare. Thomas had been 22 years old when he shipped out. He was still 22 when all of this happened, though he would later say that by that point he felt much older. Not wiser. Just older. There is a difference. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio. His father worked at a hardware store. His mother kept a garden. He had a younger sister named Claire who sent him drawings in her letters. Crayon drawings of the house, the dog, the tree in the backyard with the rope swing still hanging from the lowest branch. He kept every one of them, folded small, tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket close to his chest. He was not the kind of man who talked about himself. His commanding officer would later describe him as reliable, steady. The kind of soldier you wanted beside you not because he was the fastest or the strongest, but because he didn't panic. Because when everything around him was falling apart, Thomas stayed still. That quality would be tested on the night of November 11th, 1944. The village didn't have much of a name by that point. It had been passed back and forth between forces enough times that whatever it had once been called felt almost beside the point. What it was now was a cluster of stone buildings around a small square, half of them damaged, most of them empty. Command had sent Thomas's unit in to confirm the area was clear. Intelligence said the German forces had pulled back 2 days earlier. The village was supposed to be abandoned. Supposed to be. Thomas and 2 other men, a corporal named Eddie and a private they all called Swede, though he was from Minnesota, went in first. That was how it worked. The 3 of them had done this enough times that they moved without speaking, communicating in glances and gestures, a language that had no words and needed none. The square was empty. A chair had been knocked over in front of what might have once been a cafe. A window on the 2nd floor of a stone house had been left open, and a curtain was moving in the wind. Small details. The kind you noticed because noticing small details was how you stayed alive. They moved down the main street, building by building. Left side, then right. Methodical. The kind of slow and deliberate work that looks like nothing from the outside but costs everything on the inside. Most of the buildings were empty. A few had been used recently. A fire that had burned down to cold ash, a pile of empty tins, a blanket left behind on a stone floor. Signs of people who had been there and were now somewhere else. Then they reached the last building on the left side of the street. It was a small house. 2 floors. The door was closed but not locked. Thomas stood to one side of it. Eddie stood to the other. Swede was behind them, watching the street. Thomas put his hand on the door. He pushed it open. The room was dark. What light there was came from a single candle on a table in the far corner, burned almost all the way down, the flame small and unsteady. And in that candlelight, Thomas saw him, a man sitting in a chair against the far wall. German uniform, no helmet, no weapon that Thomas could see. His hands were not on a rifle, not reaching for anything. He was completely still, because in his arms he was holding a baby, an infant, wrapped in a piece of gray wool, eyes open, not making a sound. For a moment, and Thomas would spend the rest of his life thinking about how long that moment lasted, whether it was 2 seconds or 10 or something in between. Nobody moved. The man looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the man, and the baby looked at nothing in particular, the way babies do, with that complete and unhurried attention that belongs only to people who have not yet learned to be afraid of anything. Thomas's finger was on the trigger. Everything he had been trained to do was clear. The situation was clear. The protocol was clear. This was not a complicated decision from a military standpoint. There was an enemy soldier in front of him in a building that was supposed to be empty in a village that was supposed to be clear, and the correct response was not something that required discussion, but the baby wasn't crying, it was just looking at him. Thomas took a step back, just one step, but that was the step. Everything that followed came from that one step. He turned to Eddie without a word. The look on his face said everything. Eddie stared at him for a moment, a long moment, and then gave the smallest possible nod. Not agreement exactly, more like an acknowledgement, like he understood what was happening even if he couldn't say whether it was right. Thomas looked back at the man in the chair one more time. The man had not moved. He was not going to move. He understood exactly what was happening, and he was doing the only thing he could do, which was stay completely still and hold his child and wait. Thomas pulled the door closed. He walked back out into the street. Eddie followed. Swede looked at them both and then looked away, which was its own kind of answer. Clear, Thomas said. One word. And then they moved on. Nothing was written in the report that night. Nothing about the house on the left side of the street. Nothing about the man in the chair. Nothing about the baby. The village was logged as cleared, and that was the end of it, officially forever. By morning, the man was gone. Thomas went back. He told himself he wasn't sure why. Maybe he needed to confirm it. Maybe he needed to see the empty room and understand that it was over and they were all still alive, all three of them. The man and the baby and Thomas himself. The room was empty. The candle had burned out. The chair was still there against the wall. But on the step outside the door he found something, folded inside a small piece of cloth. Left where it would not be missed. A medal, Iron Cross, 2nd class, German military honor, the kind that was given to men who had done something in the war that their commanders decided was worth recognizing. Thomas didn't know any of that at the time. He just saw a piece of metal on a ribbon, worn and scratched, clearly something that had been carried for a long time. He stood there on that step for a long time, holding it. He didn't know what it meant. He wasn't sure it meant anything that could be put into words, but he understood, in the way that you sometimes understand things that cannot be explained, that the man had left it deliberately, had taken it off and wrapped it carefully and placed it where Thomas would find it. Was it a thank you? He didn't know. Was it an apology for being there at all? He didn't know that either. Or was it something simpler than any of that? A man saying in the only language available to him at that moment, I was here. I was real. I had something worth leaving behind. Thomas put it in his pocket. He never told anyone. He came home in the spring of 1945. Ohio. The hardware store. The garden. The tree with the rope swing, which was still there, which surprised him. He married a woman named Ruth 2 years later. They had 3 children, then grandchildren. Then a life that looked from the outside like a quiet and ordinary life, which in many ways it was. He was a good husband, a patient father, a man who showed up on time and kept his word and didn't ask for more than his share of anything. His neighbors liked him. His children loved him. Nobody who knew him would have described him as a man carrying something heavy. But every November in the days around the 11th, something in him went somewhere else. Just for a few days. Ruth noticed it early in their marriage and asked about it once carefully, the way you ask about something when you're not sure you want the full answer. Thomas said it was just the time of year. Cold weather. Old memories. She didn't ask again. The bag lived at the back of the closet in the small room he used as a study. It had other things in it. The broken compass, the unfinished letters, a photograph or two. But the metal was always there, wrapped in the same piece of cloth he had found it in, which was itself now worn thin with age. He would take it out and hold it, and then put it back. That was all. Thomas died in February of 2009. He was 87 years old. The obituary said he was a veteran of the Second World War, a loving husband and father, a man who would be deeply missed. All of those things were true. When his daughter Margaret and her husband cleared out the study, they found the bag. She almost didn't open it. It looked like the kind of thing you set aside to go through later, the accumulated private weight of a long life, the things that don't obviously belong anywhere and don't obviously need to be thrown away. She had boxes of things like that already. But she opened it, and she found the metal, and under the metal, folded so many times it had gone soft along the creases, a small piece of paper in her father's handwriting. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the careful, slightly slanted letters he had always made, the way he pressed a little too hard with the pen so the words were almost engraved into the paper. It said, "This is not mine." But I could never bring myself to throw it away. Maybe someone will return it one day. That was all, no explanation, no context. No name, no date, no location. Just those 3 sentences and 68 years of silence. Margaret spent 2 years trying to find out where it came from. It was not easy. Military records from that period were incomplete, damaged, lost, scattered across archives in 3 countries. The name engraved on the back of the metal was partially worn away. There were dead ends and wrong turns and months when it seemed like the answer simply didn't exist anymore, had dissolved into the past along with everything else from that autumn in 1944. But she kept going, and in 2011, she found them, a family in the south of France, the granddaughter of a man named Georg, a German soldier who had survived the war and come home and never spoken much about it either, which was a thing that seemed to be true of many men who had been there, regardless of which side of the line they had stood on. Georg had died in 1987. His granddaughter was a woman in her 40s named Anne. She had known her grandfather as a quiet man who kept a garden and was patient with children and cried once, only once, that she had ever seen, watching the news on a winter evening without explaining why. Had never heard the name Thomas. She had never heard the story of the village. She had never known that her grandfather had left something behind on a doorstep in November of 1944, and that a young soldier from Ohio had carried it home and kept it for the rest of his life. They met on a Tuesday in October in a town in southern France, at a table in a restaurant that was nothing special, which was exactly right. Margaret, her brother, Anne, and her husband. The medal was placed on the table. For a while, nobody said anything. There didn't seem to be a place to start. Or maybe there were too many places and none of them felt adequate. Finally, Anne picked it up, turned it over in her hands, looked at the worn place on the back where the name had almost disappeared. She said, "He would have understood why your father kept it." That was all, but it was enough. We don't know exactly what happened in that room on the night of November 11th, 1944. We don't know what Georg was thinking when he heard that door open. We don't know what he felt when Thomas stepped back and pulled the door closed. We don't know how long he sat there before he decided it was safe to leave, or how he got out of the village, or where he went after that. We don't know what became of the baby. We don't know what Thomas thought about on all those November nights when he sat alone with the medal in his hands. What question he was asking himself. Whether he ever found the answer. What we know is this. One night in a cold village in northern France, a young man put his finger on a trigger and then chose not to pull it. That decision was never recorded, never honored, never rewarded. There was no ceremony for it, no mention in any official report, no medal. Because the things that take the most courage in a war are often exactly the things that leave no trace. Thomas never called himself a hero, never suggested that what he did was remarkable, never, as far as anyone knows, even thought of it that way. He just knew that there was a man in a chair holding a baby, and that the baby was looking at him, and that he could not do what he had been trained to do. And he kept that knowledge to himself for 68 years because there was no language for it that the world around him would have understood. Maybe there still isn't. If you found a medal like that in a bag in a closet, with a note and no explanation, what would you do? Tell me in the comments.